This is the Interested Interview. I'm your host, JJ Clarke. Today I'm speaking about beekeeping. On the line is Derek Hanley, who is the chairperson of the Irish Beekeepers Association. Derek, thanks for coming on.
No problem, JJ.
So, people own dogs, people own cats. I'm interested because not a lot of people I know own bees. Can you tell us the story about how you got into beekeeping?
It was just an interest that I had. I was fascinated by nature, I suppose, and beekeeping just became part of something that I got involved in. I'm involved about 15 years now. I've had bees, and they're fascinating.
And I mean, when you get into it, when you start off, like, what are the basic things that you need to be a beekeeper? So you need a hive, you need actual bees. Where does that all come from? Can you just take me through that?
The first thing I would suggest, JJ, is that you need knowledge. And the best place to get that is to get involved in your local beekeeping association. Most of them would run beginners courses, and they're generally 6 to 8 weeks long, normally early in the year, kind of February, March time. They run them just before the beekeeping season begins. So you learn at lectures, and then again, most beekeeping associations will then go on to the practical side, where they will bring the beginners out, put them in bee suits, bring them to an apiary, which is where we keep beehives, a number of beehives, and they will open up the hives with the beginners and get them handling the frames of bees, showing them the difference between adult bees, queen bees, the queen bee, trying to find the queen bee for them, the difference between male and female, the drones and the workers, showing them the different kinds of brood, which is the developing eggs, larvae and pupae in the cells, where they keep the pollen and where they store the honey.
And in terms of, you just touched on it there, so within a hive, there's 3 types of bee: the queen, the drone, and the worker.
Yes.
Can you go into that a little bit? How do they differ? Can you delineate a tiny bit?
Okay, in every hive, in every colony of bees, there's one queen. She is, I suppose you could describe her as the mother of the hive. She is the one from whom all of the bees in the hive originate. So they're fascinating. The queen in a hive can live up to 5 years, but generally it would be a bit shorter than that. Whereas the other bees have much shorter lifespans. So the queen is the important one in reproduction of the individual bees, the workers and the drones. The drones are the male bees, and they're only present in the hive during the summer. So from late spring until summer, and in the colony of bees, you could have between 300 and 500 drones during that period. Their only function is to mate with the queen, but they don't do that in the hive. They leave the hive and they fly off into what they call drone congregation areas, where they're waiting for young queens who are out on their mating flights to mate with. That's the drone's only function. So when they go back to the hive, then they're basically a burden on the hive. The worker bees have to feed them, and they don't contribute. The drones don't contribute anything other than this mating service, as it were, for the hive. But again, unfortunately for the drones, once they mate with a queen, they die. And at the end of their productive period in the hive, when it's about this time of the year, maybe a little bit later, the workers decide, we don't need you anymore, and they kick them out. So there's no drones in the hive then over the winter period.
And so the workers are female? The
workers are all female. Their reproductive function is suppressed completely. So they don't lay eggs, they just basically do all the work in the hive. And again, the numbers in the hive during the peak period of the year, you could have 50 to 70,000 worker bees in a colony.
Wow.
But that will reduce right back down to maybe 5 to 10,000 during the winter. And again, it's amazing that the lifespan, During the summer when the bees are working, when the workers are working, generally you're talking about 6 weeks, and they really work themselves to death. And they have, at different stages during their life, they have different jobs. So they start off doing stuff like just cleaning up around the hive. Then they do feeding the larvae in the hive. They do other jobs then, like you have guard bees that guard the entrance to the hive. You have bees that the worker bees around the hive that take the pollen and nectar from the foraging workers, and they store it in the honeycomb. And then later on, they all become foragers when they leave the hive, and they go off and they forage for pollen and nectar that they get from plants all around them.
And the history of beekeeping is very, very interesting to me, because for me, I thought that bees just are naturally occurring, that we have like Irish bees as opposed to, British bees. But I then read that they were brought over after the last ice age to Ireland, and there's references to bees in the Brehon laws, like about compensation if you got stung by someone's bees, or if your hens ate someone's bees, that you'd have to compensate them. So they've been here a while. Yeah,
they've been here. They've been here a very long time. There is a great history in Ireland of beekeeping, and as you mentioned, the Brehon laws had specific laws relating to bees and how people were compensated for various different things, and if a swarm arrived on your land, who owned the swarm. So it was all fascinating. But originally, I suppose it goes back to the forager, that when people were hunter-gatherers, they used to basically raid the swarms or the colonies and just take away the honey. And the bees managed quite well enough with that, because not all of their honey was taken, and not all of the colonies were raided. So they managed to survive the mankind's interference with them. And then they started kind of managing bees. They used to keep them in, archaeologists can show you around the place what they call bee bowls, which are little cavities in walls into which they put skeps. Now, a skep was a very old-fashioned hive. It was kind of woven from either grass, straw, that kind of stuff. They used longer grass types, and they used to bind them together into ropes using brambles, from the blackberries that they split down. And they would then be into a kind of a cone shape. It's a kind of, the old traditional skep. But when they kept the bees in skeps, when they went to get the honey, they destroyed the colony, basically. They ripped out everything that was there to get at the honey, and the bees had to start from scratch again. So that then developed eventually, where a guy called Langstroth, Reverend Langstroth, developed what they called movable frame hives, where you could the bees were encouraged to build their wax comb into frames, into timber frames that could be lifted out and put back in without damaging them, and that kind of transformed beekeeping to what it is today, because basically today it's a variation of that kind of beekeeping is what we do to manage bees. So honeybees in Ireland, the Apis mellifera would have been the bee that would have been native to this part of Europe, so it would be very similar to the bees in the UK and parts of Western Europe. There were the bees that were in nature as part of this area.
Right, and just in terms of, you said honeybees. Are there bees that aren't honeybees in Ireland?
Oh yeah, we have a huge number of different bees. We have bumblebees that everybody's familiar with. I think there's 22 different varieties of or species of honey or of bumblebees in Ireland, and then there's the solitary bees. And I think we have there's only one species of honeybee, Apis mellifera, but there are, I think it's 22 different species of bumblebee, and I think altogether there's about 98 species of bee in Ireland. So we have the solitary bees, the bumblebees, and the honeybee.
That's fascinating.
Bees are fascinating. I generally come at social events with a health warning. Don't ask him about bees because he'll never shut up.
And I'm interested as well. You went through the different types of bees within the beehive. Are there any physical differences? You mentioned at the outset that with the beginners you show them how to find the queen bee. How do you identify? Because it's bees to me, they look all the same, but obviously there's differences between them.
Oh, there is, yeah. And again, that comes with experience, and that comes, I suppose, mentoring is the best way to learn about that. And that's why I would encourage anybody that's interested to do a beekeeping course and get out and get at the hive and get looking. And the beekeepers, the experienced beekeepers, will show you how to spot the queen. Now, the queen is, it would be longer and slimmer than any other bees in the hive. Her wings wouldn't come the whole length of her body, whereas with the drones and the workers, they would be almost the same length as their body. And when the beekeeper finds the queen bee, quite often what they do is they mark her back, her thorax, with a little spot of marker paint. And it's done over a 5-year. There are 5 different colours that they mark them, and by looking at a bee, you can tell what year that queen was born. And that's generally what most beekeepers, I'd say, would do that. It makes finding the queen much easier when you open the hive, because she can be difficult to spot. There's a significant difference then in size between the worker and the drone. The drone is much a broader insect, quite a good bit bigger than the workers. Again, beginners sometimes get a little bit confused. Oh, they spot a drone and think, is that the queen because it's bigger? But no, there is a difference in girth, I suppose, between the queen and the drones. And again, there's a lot of drones that you would see around in the hive during the main kind of summer season. And again, sometimes what people do to show beginners how to mark the queen, they have to be very careful that they don't damage the queen when they're marking her. So sometimes what they do is they get them to practice on drones, marking the drones, and that gives the beginner confidence, because the drone has no sting. It doesn't sting. Whereas the worker has a sting and will use it, and the queen has a sting but very, very seldom uses it. So handling the queen is safe, as in you're not going to get stung. Handling drones is similar. You're not going to get stung. It's the workers that are more likely to sting you.
And with the sting there, I'm interested in the relationship most people have with bees. So most people will think of bees and say, okay, the last time I interacted with a bee was when I got stung that one time when I was a child. So the fear element of dealing with bees, and presumably you're wearing the protective, beekeeper suit when you're interacting with the bees. How do you overcome that first element of a lot of bees flying at you and, presumably on the defensive?
Yeah, well, honeybees will only sting in a defensive manner, and generally when you get stung by a honeybee, you're interfering with something that the bee doesn't want you to interfere with. So if you're going near the hive, if you're interfering with their food stores or their brood, they get defensive, obviously. They discourage you by stinging you, to encourage you to move away. So what beekeepers do is they put on full protective equipment when they're working with or managing their bees. So that goes from, it has to be completely sealed. So what we encourage beginners to do is they wear Wellington boots with the bee suit tucked into the Wellington boots, because when the bees land on you, they generally go upwards, not back down, if you understand that. So when they
focus on the head, do they?
The suit. And again, you would have a layer or two under the bee suit, so that you wouldn't just wear a light T-shirt under your bee suit unless you're very, very confident that your bees are docile. And again, you wear gloves, and the important one is the veil to protect your face. And again, underneath the veil, what we would encourage beginners to do is to wear a baseball cap, which keeps the veil out from your face. so that if they land on the mesh on the front of your veil, that they can't get at your skin.
And can you describe just the inner landscape of the hive itself? So you described the slats that you can take up, from the actual hive, and the different slats that go into a hive. Is there different sections of the hive, the actual wooden housing or whatever material is being used? Is there a section where the queen is and where the workers drop the payload of the nectar or whatever?
Okay, the hive in general, now there are different kinds of hive. Firstly, the material they're made from. Traditionally, they're made from timber. The lightest timber would be cedar, but you can use different kinds of timber as well for the hive. There's also polystyrene hives that are available, and they're much better insulated, but there are pros and cons with the use of both, and there are fans of both amongst beekeepers. So I'm not going to get into which is better. But then the hive itself, you start off at the bottom with the floor of the hive. Then on top of that, they have what we call the brood box, which is a big enough box. It's bigger than the rest of the boxes on the hive, and that's where the queen. In general, people kind of contain the queen in the brood box, and that's where she lays her eggs, and the eggs develop through the different stages until they become adult bees. And inside in that, alongside where the brood area or the brood nest is, just on the outside of the nest, you will have pollen. So what the bees feed to the larvae is a mixture of honey and pollen. So there will be stores in the brood box as well on the outside. So again, you have all of the food available for the workers to feed the larvae. You have the pollen and you have the honey. But then what beekeepers do then is they put what they call a queen excluder on top of the brood box, which is like a mesh that is small enough or big enough for the workers to get through, but the drones and the queen can't get through it. So when the bees are looking for space, when there's what we call a honey flow on, which is kind of June, July, it would be the peak honey flow in Ireland. When the foragers are bringing in loads of honey and they're passing it in to store it, when they run out of space in the brood area, they bring it up through this queen excluder into what we call the supers, which is a smaller box with frames in it that the bees they bring it in as nectar. They store it in the cells in the honeycomb, and they extract moisture from it in order to get it to a certain moisture level. And then once it gets to that level and the cell is full, they cap it with wax. Okay. And once that honey is capped with wax, it'll store forever. Wow. It's incredible how resilient it is and how long it can last. So although we are required in Ireland and in the EU, when beekeepers are extracting honey and jarring the honey to sell or to give to people, we have to put a best before date on it. And the best before date, basically, if I put best before 2090, there's nobody can disagree with me once it's properly stored. And the best way to store it is in the comb that the bees put it in, capped by wax.
And why is it that you put a queen excluder? Why do you not want the queen to go into the different parts of the hive?
Well, what you're doing there, first of all, if you have a very big, if you have a very strong hive, and if you're lucky enough, you could have maybe, I suppose, certainly 2, maybe 3, and in a really good year, 4 or 5 supers in the hive.
So a tall box,
and then
basically.
Every time you go to look at it, so you need to manage your hive. So you need to look, the beekeeper will generally look through their hive about once every 10 days, a week or 10 days, to make sure that the bees aren't in a swarmy, about to start swarming. So if you have to look through all of those supers in order to check for swarming because the queen may be laying up in the supers, well then that's quite a big job for you. Whereas if you just contain her in the one box at the bottom, the brood box, then it's much easier to spot the signs of swarming. And the other thing too is that if you're using the honey, if you're extracting the honey, you don't want to have brood in it because it makes the extraction more difficult and messy.
Yeah, and with that, I'm kind of interested in the behaviour of, you mentioned it there, of the queen, and when beehives tend to swarm. Like, when is that? I've heard that sometimes it's like with thundery weather.
No, swarming is basically the reproduction of bees. I've mentioned the queen is the one that lays the eggs and reproduces the individual insects, whether they're workers, drones, or possibly new queens. But it's not the reproduction of the individual insect that's important. It's the reproduction of the colony, because no one individual bee insect can survive on their own. They can only survive as members of a colony. So the reproduction of the colony is essential for the reproduction of the honeybee. So that's why beekeepers often refer to the colony as a superorganism. It's not. It's so the reproduction of the colony is the important thing. Now, they do that for various different reasons at different times of the year. So they will always swarm. There's an old saying about a swarm: if a beekeeper catches a swarm. A swarm of bees in May is worth a cock of hay. A swarm of bees in June is worth a silver spoon. And a swarm of bees in July isn't worth a fly. So the best time for the colony to reproduce is early in the season, where they have time to get the colony numbers up and to gather enough food stores, nectar primarily, to help them to survive the winter. So there are a number of reasons why a colony might swarm. Primarily it's to reproduce.
Right.
So, but it also can swarm for other reasons. If the beekeeper isn't watching their hives properly and not giving them enough space to store their nectar in, and not giving them enough room for all the bees that are being produced, well, then the colony will swarm in order to give themselves more space in the hive that they have, and also to set up a new colony somewhere else. That's swarming is kind of something that the beekeepers have to manage. You can manage it to the beekeeper's benefit, in that you can do it in a manner where you can get yourself an extra colony of bees in a new hive, or you can do it in a manner whereby you will maximize your honey production, because when the colony splits like that in two, the two colonies are a bit weaker, so they're going to not be as good at producing honey that year. So again, these are all things that you learn during the beginner's course.
And does a queen produce another queen in that swarming instance that sort of flies off, or does the old queen stay in the current hive, or does the old queen who's produced a new younger queen relocate somewhere?
So what happens is, for the normal swarming that you get, the queen will lay an egg, a fertilized egg, in a queen cell. So the normal cells that the queen lays her brood in are horizontal, slightly off the horizontal, and they're a particular size. Whereas the queen cells, the bees build a vertical cell on the side of the comb.
Okay.
And the queen then lays an egg in that, and it develops. They develop over different times, so the workers, the queens, and the drones take different lengths of time to develop. And any fertilized egg can become either a worker or a queen. It's just how the bees feed it determine how it's going to end up as either a queen or a worker. And again, it's so fascinating. There are pheromones involved in how this all happens. So when the queen is getting weaker, for example, if it's getting older, her pheromone reduces in the hive. The reduction of that pheromone kicks the worker bees into saying, there's something going wrong here, we need a new queen, let's build queen cells, get her to lay eggs in those cells, and we'll have a new queen.
Wow.
So when the queen lays into the various different queen cells, and again, the normal swarming, you'd have quite a number of cells. You could have kind of 7 up to, I've heard of up to 20 queen cells in a swarming hive sometimes. So what happens then, again, is fascinating. Once the queen cells are capped, So once they're finished feeding it and they seal the cell, then the old queen leaves the hive with about half of the flying bees. And that's what a swarm is. So before they actually leave, so when the queen cells are what we call charged, the bees reduce how much they feed to the queen, because the queen has to be fed an awful lot every day, because she's laying so many eggs. I mean, in the peak period, she can lay up to 1,500 eggs a day.
Wow. So
they reduce the feed, so she stops laying, and now she slims down, so she's more capable of flying. And the workers then kind of push her out of the hive and encourage her to fly off with them. So that leaves then, so half of your flying bees are gone with the old queen to set up a new colony somewhere else. Now you have a number of different queen cells left behind. And my understanding is that the bees can then, they can make up their mind what they want to do. And this seems so strange for an insect with such a small brain, that they can decide, okay, we're going to stay here. They kind of figure out which is going to be the best queen while it's still inside in the cell. And if a queen that they don't particularly want wants to leave a cell, they can kind of trap it in the cell and encourage the favoured queen to come out.
That's bizarre. And
sometimes that happens, and sometimes the bees just leave it to the queens to emerge. The first one out is the best. And the first queen that emerges can go around to the other queen cells, and it's the only time that it'll use its sting, and it'll sting through the cell wall and kill the remaining virgin queens that are left in the queen cells. And that leaves then just one virgin queen in the old colony with the remainder of the bees. And then after about 4 or 5 days, she develops, and then she leaves the hive on mating flights.
And I heard that the mating flights is they fly. The drones make a noise, that like a sort of droning noise or like a humming, and that they fly high, very like to a particular altitude, to meet the queen. Is that so, or is that?
Well, what happens is I mentioned earlier on the drone congregation areas. So the drones from all the hives in an area congregate in a particular area, and they're flying around. They're quite high up. It's like a column of drones flying around the place, and they're emitting a pheromone that the virgin queen can pick up. So she leaves the hive. She's accompanied by workers. They fly off with her, and they head towards these drone congregation areas. Now, when the virgin queen comes close to that, the bees can sense her coming, the drones, and they fly off to grab her. They mate with her in the air. Now, as I say, as the drone mates with the queen in the air, he falls off the queen and he drops to the ground, leaving a certain part of his anatomy behind it with the queen. And the poor queen then will continue to fly in that area and may mate 4 or 5 times, return to the hive, get cleaned off by the workers, a couple of hours later fly off again. And this will happen over a number of days. So the queen could mate with 18, 20 different drones. And ideally the drones would be from other hives from around the area.
Why is that ideal?
Because you're increasing the genetic diversity.
Okay.
You don't want her mating with a related male from her own hive. So again, it's absolutely fascinating. So after those few days and mating with as many drones as she can manage, and she goes back to the hive, and then after a few days she can start laying, and she will never mate again. And as you know, so that queen can survive for years laying eggs. And as I said, during the peak laying period, there can be up to 1,500 eggs a day, which is probably approximates the weight, her own body weight in eggs. And that's why she has to be constantly fed by the workers in the hive. And the other fascinating thing about the queen laying the eggs, and whether or not they're going to be drones or workers, the drone cell is slightly bigger in diameter to the worker cell. Now so what happens is the queen kind of reverses into the cell, and when she's reversing into the cell, she's feeling the width of the cell with her back legs. And if it's a wide cell, a drone cell, she will lay an unfertilized egg into that cell, which will become a drone. And if she reverses into a narrower cell, which is a worker cell, again, sensing the size of the cell with her back legs, She then knows that she's in a worker cell, so she'll lay a fertilized egg into that cell, which will become a worker, or if she does it in a queen cell, it'll become a queen.
And Derek, do we know about the honeycomb structure? Why does that occur? Is that because of the actual design of the hive, or is there a reason for it?
It's one of the best. It's the hexagonal shape that knits in so neatly together. And I mean, the honeycomb itself, it's made from beeswax, which is very thin. But because of the way that they lay it, or that they construct it, it's so strong when all of it is combined. So nature has come up with a method for the bees to use their wax in a method where they can either have their young raised in the cell, or they can store either pollen or nectar and turn it into honey in such a fashion that when they seal it over, if they seal it over on a larvae, it then pupates and becomes a young bee. Or if it's stores such as the nectar, which they've extracted the moisture from, down to I think it's about 18%, and then it's honey. And then they seal that over, and it stays as honey, and it doesn't deteriorate. There's so many things about bees are so incredible.
Yeah, and I'm interested as well. I've seen a lot of beekeepers approach hives and use smoke. What are they using that smoke for? In a kind of it looks like a tin can or something.
Yeah, it's a method for calming the bees down. For controlling the aggression in some hives that you might have. What it does is it masks the pheromone. Remember I referred to the guard bees earlier on. So the guard bees are just at the entrance, and they're checking all the bees coming in to see that, it's not, if it was a wasp coming in to rob them, it'll attack them. Anyway, if there's a danger, these guard bees set off a pheromone, which alerts the rest of the bees in the hive, I need help here, there's something coming that's endangering the hive. So the other workers then come out and they become guards. So by using smoke, one of the things that the smoke does is it masks that pheromone in the hive, so that the alarm signal being sent by the guard bees is not being distributed efficiently throughout the hive. And the other thing that the smoke does, and again, this is the bees' preferred place in nature would be a hollow in a tree. Okay. That's where they kind of existed for years and years, for thousands of years. That was their preferred location, a hollow in a tree, preferably up a few meters away from predators and stuff like that. So if the tree was in a forest and there was a fire in the forest, you get smoke. And the smoke triggers the bee to think there's a danger that there's a forest fire, so we might have to leave in a hurry. So what the bees do is they start filling themselves up with honey, so that when they leave the hive, they will have stores with them. And when they fill themselves up with honey, they become less inclined to sting.
Why is that?
When they leave the hive and their bellies are full of honey, they can't arch and sting as easily. It's less easy for them physiologically to sting you.
That's brilliant.
And the other thing is that when they leave the hive like that and they're full of honey, as I said before, bees sting defensively, and they're defending either their brood or their stores. So when they leave in a swarm with their bellies full of honey, they have nothing to defend. They have no brood with them, and they have no stores to defend. So again, they're less likely to sting. Now, I'm not saying they won't sting you, but it's far less likely that they will sting you in a swarm. So if you ever come across a swarm of bees, you can do it. Walking down the street, a swarm of bees can descend and kind of. I've seen one swarm on a traffic light in a town.
Wow.
So, and a lot of bees, and everybody runs away panicking. But actually, the bees are probably at their safest, least likely to sting you when they're in a swarm. Now, I wouldn't go put my hand into the middle of it if you're not a beekeeper and know what you're doing, but there's no need to be too upset about a swarm. They're less likely to sting you in a swarm than they are if you approach their hive.
When they stock up on nectar before they fly out and sort of food stores. Is there, like, I've heard that they're like a little, it's almost like they're a little bit drunk or something, or is that not the case? It's just the physiological that they can't turn their backs to sting properly.
Well, it's a combination, as I've said. Physiologically, it's less likely that they will sting because they're so full of honey, and they have nothing to defend. They're the two reasons that they're less likely. I haven't heard the drunk one before, but that's interesting.
And you mentioned wasps there. Do wasps try and attack beehives?
Later on in the year, they do, kind of from about August, mid-August into September. And again, this is another, beekeepers generally are very interested in nature. So wasps are the ones that the ones in the Kilkenny colours, as we say, the black and yellow. And during the early part of the year, when the queen wasp is starting her new colony, what she's looking to feed the young, the larvae in that colony, is protein that she gets primarily from taking away all those things like aphids and caterpillars that you don't want in your garden and other insects like that. So they're feeding protein like that, so they're not so much interested in the sugars. Later on in the year, as I said, from about mid-August into September, and depending on the year, even later than that, where the wasps would normally be getting what they're looking for is the carbohydrate, and they're getting that from sugars in fruits. So that's why apples and stuff like that would have been their natural, and other fruits, source of food at that time of the year for the wasps. So they're looking for sugars. So one of the great places for them to get sugars would be from honey, and that's why the wasps would raid only later on in the year the beehives, and they can be quite difficult if you have a weak hive. They're far more likely to be literally taken out of it by wasps, and they will take all of their stores and kill off the hive.
And in terms of, I suppose, defences that you could, as a beekeeper, create for your beehive, is there anything that a beekeeper can do
to defend the hive against wasps? Well, one of the things that they would do is they would reduce the size of the entrance of the hive so that the guard bees have a smaller area to protect. And the other thing is there are various different wasp traps that beekeepers set up around the place to get the wasps, because at this time of the year they're kind of dying off. But what the wasps are doing is at that time of the year they're producing new queens, which will fly off, will hibernate for the winter, and then start new colonies in the spring. So the worker wasps are they're feeding up with the sugars, bringing those back to feed the larvae. So what you're trying to do is distract them away from your honey and to put them into a trap, and they're easy enough traps to make up, or you can buy wasp traps as well. You're putting a sweet fluid into an area where the wasps fly into, but they find it difficult to get back out of.
And in terms of, I suppose, the difference between a wasp and a bee, I was always told as a youngster playing around in the garden is wasps can sting more. And the bees, they die with that because their sting has a barb at the end of it.
That's
it
correct.
pulls out their.
Yeah. So a wasp has no barbs on its stinger, so it can sting you over and over again. So a honeybee can only sting you once because of that barb. The barb gets trapped in your skin, and when it pulls out, it leaves the sting and part of its abdomen behind. Now, again, for people that don't know much about stings, if you see a sting left behind after you've been stung, then it's a honeybee. So what you do is you get something like a credit card or a knife or something like that, and you scrape it from the side out. Because if you try and grab it with your finger and thumb, there's a little venom sac at the end of the stinger, and by pinching it, you're squeezing the rest of the venom through the stinger into your body, and you get a more vicious or violent kind of reaction because there's a lot more venom in. Whereas if you scrape it from the side out, you don't get that additional venom into your system. It's if you were to look at it, if you had the time and the patience and the pain threshold to look at it, the little venom sac, it's quite small, it's still pulsing, pushing the venom in after the bee has left. So you just want to get that out as quick as you can without squeezing all the venom into you.
And with bees and honeybees in particular, is it because of nature that like they were fending off bears and stuff that they tend to go for the head rather than the legs or the extremities? They fly upwards towards and focus on the head.
Well, they do tend to go for your face if they can, but I've often heard of some vicious hives where they have the ankle attackers, which can also be quite difficult, and that's why they encourage beginners to wear Wellington boots when you're going to the hives. But they would go for the head area generally more, and a sting in the head often reacts very badly. You see people who just, their face tends to swell up a bit, particularly up around the eyes, and that's the area that they can go for, yes.
And with the honey itself, I'm always fascinated to read the labels and see like hazel honey and ivy honey, and wherever they draw how effective is the source of the nectar at influencing the taste of the honey. And like you have heather honey is particularly popular in Ireland. How does it play out into the honey?
It is the determining factor of the taste of the honey, and again, experienced beekeepers can tell. Some of them extract at particular times so they know what the honey is, what the bees are foraging on at the time. So earlier on in the year, they will be foraging on, in nature, it'll be dandelions. In agriculture, it will be oilseed rape. And then as the year progresses, there are different crops that come into flower that the bees will tend to go to. You'll have apple blossom, you'll have hawthorn, you'll have lime trees is a lovely one that you often get in the States around the place, or in cities, the lime. It's not the citrus lime. That's a lovely honey. You can get blackberry honey or clover honey, and as you said, then what some beekeepers do is they bring the colony up to the mountains up where the heather is, and that's about this time of the year, about the end of July into early August. Where they put the bees on the heather. The heather honey is interesting. It's called it's not like your runny honey. It's described as thixotrophic. It's like a jelly. It's more difficult for the beekeeper to extract, but it is a premium honey. And again, maybe I should have warned you again that I'll talk to you about bees forever. But then when you mention honey, I keep going on and on and on. There are so many things about honey. When you look at a jar of honey that you buy in a supermarket, in the small print on somewhere there, you will see produce of EU and non-EU is generally what you will see. So that honey could have come from anywhere, where the regulation on it wouldn't certainly be as strong as it would be in the EU or in Ireland.
Right.
So what I would encourage people to do, if they can, is to try and buy from local beekeepers. So go online, look for your local beekeeping association and contact them. Health food shops, some of the supermarkets have local honey in it, but they tend not to have the quantities they have of some of the others that make themselves out to be Irish, but if you read the small print, they're not. Right. And again, the beekeepers can get very perplexed when they see people spending fortunes on this Manuka honey.
Yeah,
and some of the research, and again, I'm not an expert on honey, but some of the research would indicate that maybe some of our honeys, like the heather honey, is just as good. Manuka is just marketed very well.
Yes.
If you consider that Manuka honey comes from New Zealand, a country about the same population as Ireland, and it supplies the whole world with Manuka honey. So not just New Zealand, Australia, South America, North America, Asia, Europe, everywhere. And it is said that there is more Manuka honey sold in the UK alone than is produced by New Zealand every year.
Yeah, I've heard that statistic that 80 million tonnes of Manuka honey are sold annually, or it's some figure like that.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the figures are, JJ, but they're huge. It's one of actually the most counterfeited foods in the world.
Yes.
So what happens in some countries, and I won't go naming countries because I'm not 100% sure how accurate some of the stuff that we're hearing is, and of course I will be biased towards bees and beekeepers, but there are areas where it is said that they would have like Olympic-sized swimming pools area of syrup, which is just sugar and water, with floats on it, and they surround it with beehives, and the bees. Oh, here's a source of sugars for us. So they land on these floats, they take the syrup, they bring it back to the hive, and because it has been through a bee and produced in a beehive, you can call it honey.
Yes.
So, but what the key to it for the authenticity of your honey is to have it examined in a laboratory and look for example, if it says that this is an Irish honey, well then they will look for the pollen from Irish plants in that honey. And if it's not there, and so again, what some of the huge producers of this cheap honey do is there will be a certain amount of honey in it, but they will microfilter it so that there's no pollen left in it, and they can't tell where it has come from.
Yeah, and I mean the effectiveness of slapping the tag superfood on anything makes it infinitely more marketable and thus more sellable.
Yeah. So again, I go back to what I said. The best way to get your local honey is to contact your local beekeeping association, and they will put you in touch with a local supplier. Or there's a website called Find Your Keeper, I think it's called, where you contact this person and they will put you in touch with a local honey supplier. And
especially in times like these, you'd want to support your local businesses.
Absolutely,
as well. Yes. And just on I suppose a lighter note, just your 15 years into beekeeping, do you wear protective gear the same? I've seen sort of crazy videos and images of beekeepers all around the world that don't mask up and don't tend to get stung as much. And is that a sort of, I suppose, a thing that you just become naturally more relaxed, and people who fidget and fuss around bees and get freaked out easily?
Well, look, it depends. I would always wear my protective gear when I go to the bees. Sometimes a beekeeper can tell, particularly an experienced beekeeper, when they go to the bees by just standing and looking at the hive, what mood that hive is in. And they have moods. So you can tell they're a little bit feisty today, I'll put on the gloves. Or, God, they're working very hard, they're going to be completely concentrating on bringing in their forage, and particularly if it's a nice warm day, you can certainly open up your hive and not have your gloves on. I've been to one or two apiaries in Ireland. There's a very famous apiary down in Tipperary with Micheál McGillicuddy and his family. And I've been to a workshop there where, of course, all of the people at the workshop had all their gear on, but the locals, they didn't have their gloves on and they had their veils off, and we were all looking at them saying, God, this is dangerous. But their bees are so calm and so docile that the only person that was stung that day was they sat back and they put their hand on what they were about to sit on, and there was a honey bee on it. They squashed the bee and the bee stung them.
Okay.
But in general, particularly for beginners, we would always say, suit up completely. Don't take risks. And even after years, I will never go near my bees without my veil and my suit on. I might sometimes go at them without my gloves on, but if they're in a bad humour, the gloves go straight on.
And with, I suppose, people ordering queens, like domesticated queens, say if they have a hive that is particularly aggressive, or, is a wild hive that has colonised an empty hive box, is there, there's domesticated bees, the queen bees that get sent out, are they more likely to be more, I suppose, malleable in terms of behaviour, and that they're more docile? Is that a thing?
Well, again, if beginners will always get advised by their local associations, so I would discourage people just going on one of these sites where you can buy all sorts of things and looking for honeybees, because you have no idea what the bees are coming from. The local associations will know who in the area has good quality queens, or what we call nooks, which is a small, kind of a half-size colony that's developing, which is easier for a beginner to manage, less bees in it. There are various different sites, like there's the NIBS, which is the Native Irish Honeybee Society, there's Buckfast Society, there's other societies like that if you contact them, they will tell you which bees are, who are reliable suppliers of queens or nooks.
Right. And I suppose, finally, on a much, much lighter note, I was in the email correspondence before this interview, I was desperately trying to avoid bee puns, but I suppose you're in your line of work, you get that kind of thing all the time, like what's the buzz, or I'm droning on, or anything like that. Is when bees...
all part of the fun, JJ.
Yes, when beekeepers meet up, is there certain characteristics of a beekeeper?
There are no characteristics that I could put my finger on of a beekeeper. They come in all ages. There's very little. Most of them would be interested in nature. I know I did a course recently on communities for climate action in Kildare, and there was about 30 or 40 people did the course, and just coincidentally 12 of them were beekeepers. So beekeepers tend to be more in tune with nature and conservation, I think, just because of the type of person that they are. Sometimes beekeeping is kind of passed down through generations, and again, if you get one of those beekeepers whose bees have been in the family for generations, and there are quite a few of them around, they tend to have very good bees because they've managed them, they've bred them for docility, they've bred them for high honey production, whereas the person, that has only taken it up in a few years and decides they're going to try and make some money on this and get out as many queens as they can, you're not as sure that their bees are going to be what you want to have in your hive.
Right. Okay, perfect. Well, we'll leave it there. That is Derek Hanley, Chairperson of the Irish Beekeepers Association. Thanks very much for joining me.
You're very welcome, JJ. Anytime.